Okay, welcome to Fantastical AIs and Where to Find Them Illegal, How to Stop the US Military from Ruining AI for Everyone. We'll cover my claims, and to support them, I'll define the ways AI becomes illegal in sci-fi, examine whether it's possible in real life, show you how the US military is involved, and finally we'll discuss some ways we can mitigate the coming AI disjunction and/or apocalypse. So, here are my claims. AI is often illegal in science fiction, and reckless military application is usually to blame. The US military will certainly contribute to this trap. An AI disjunction would cause decreased quality of life and is to be avoided, and active preparation is required to avoid such a disjunction. So, there are two classes of AI disjunction that you see in sci fi, and AI disjunction is one in which humanity decides that AI cannot go unregulated. There are rejection scenarios, and we'll see an example from Dune, and revolution scenarios, which we'll see in Mass Effect and Warhammer 40k. A Class 1 rejection is when a human machine conflict in which the machines lack either interests or the means to defend themselves. In Dune, a cultural movement legitimized by religious dogma leads humanity to reject machines made in the image of man, so thinking machines are outlawed. Imagine if we all decided to stop using electronic calculators. The calculators don't think on a high enough order to have what might be called interests, and they certainly don't have access to weapons or self defense. In Dune, as it would in real life, this has led to an enormous drop in quality of life, so is to be avoided. Class 2 scenario is a revolution scenario, a human machine conflict where humans and machines have real or perceived opposed interests and military capability. In Warhammer 40k, an earlier stage of humanity created a race of thinking machines called the Men of Iron, originally meant for manual labor but eventually repurposed for warfare. In Mass Effect, an alien race called the Quarians created a synthetic race called the Geth for the same purposes. In both cases, the created race tried to destroy the AIs when they started displaying sentience. In both settings, there are hints that AI was at least frowned upon before these events, but these are the primary reasons for a legal restriction of AI that in 40k is literally religious in its absoluteness. The initiative in the conflict doesn't matter. Morpheus says as much in The Matrix, since they don't know who started the AI war, us or them. So is this possible in real life? At first, the answer seems like an obvious definitely not. These doomsday scenarios all describe artificial general intelligence. The AIs that we use are artificial limited intelligence, single task, limited in scope not by design but by the science. We simply don't know how to make artificial general intelligence yet. All we're doing is drawing boxes around faces and making movie predictions, so what's the danger? Well, I'm going to argue that even without what an academic might rigorously call artificial general intelligence, we as naval officers, researchers, practitioners, and policy thinkers are quite capable of fielding systems that can produce similar outcomes. We'll need three concepts to understand why. The first is loss or reward, the second is emergent behavior, and the third is what I'll call scope bleed. Loss and reward is a single number that measures performance. At the heart of every AI is a number that is used to measure the effectiveness of the AI in a way that it can be used to improve the AI's performance. This is called loss if it's to be minimized, or reward if it's to be maximized. An arbitrary number of factors can be represented by simply adding them. The reward or loss can best be thought of as the incentives for an AI to optimize against. In order to maximize or minimize the reward or loss, which numbers in the equation should go up and which should go down. If we imagine an infantry commander to be replaced by an artificial intelligence, how would we incentivize the AI to behave the way we want? Well, perhaps we have a reward signal that is built from square miles of territory controlled minus casualties incurred. In this scenario, we can see that increasing the controlled area and decreasing casualties results in the highest reward. That's good. That's the behavior we want to incentivize. AlphaGo made serious headlines several years ago by displaying superhuman performance in a board game thought unmanageable by machines. There are many parts to AlphaGo, but the critical core is the loss function. It has three parts, blue, green, and red. Red is a statistical thing we can ignore for now. Green provides an incentive for the AI to learn to choose better moves, and blue incentivizes the AI to predict more accurately who's winning a given board state. Not so hard, right? This is the loss function of the AI that controls data center cooling for Google. Now, having learned over several years of operation, Google's data center costs are 30% lower. 30%! The second thing we'll need to understand is emergent behavior, which is complex behavior from simple rules. In 2011, the first tournament for AIs playing the classic video game StarCraft was held, and the winner used some AI tactics that produced emergent behavior. A Mutalisk is a flight unit with a ranged attack which can be fired every few seconds but no faster. The AI written to control these flying units was told to fly toward enemies weaker than itself and away from enemies stronger than itself. Unexpectedly, the Mutalisks dive in to attack a target and then rush quickly out of enemy range and repeat this pattern over and over, as we see in the video. This behavior was not explicitly programmed in, it emerged as a result of the mutalisk assessing its own strength as low while it was reloading and high while it was able to fire. The emergent behavior keeps the mutalisk out of enemy range for most of the engagement. Again, the rules of this AI were handwritten, discrete, and interpretable, but still resulted in unexpected behavior. Something similar happens in the Asimov short story Runaround. Speedy the robot approaches a dangerous object for retrieval in order to protect humans, but when Speedy gets close enough that the danger to itself becomes greater than the benefit to humans, it backs away, until the danger is less than the benefit to the object to humans. So it wanders repeatedly in and out of range of the danger, much like these mutalisks. When emergent behavior can arise from logic-based deterministic rules, it should come as no surprise that emergent behavior can arise from a probabilistic machine-learned system as well. In this first example, a simulated hexapod robot was incentivized to maximize forward progress while minimizing foot contact with the ground. The robot did indeed maximize its reward score, but it did it by flipping upside down and using its knees to walk. In a second example, a group of robots are incentivized to find food, avoid poison, and maximize group survival. They're given control of their own lights and movement and have cameras. They learn to communicate with the other robots when they found food by changing color when the other robots learn to recognize that and follow. Later, when individual survival was incentivized, they learned to lie by emitting the I found food color when they had in fact found poison, then escaping to eat all the food itself when the other robots ate the poison. And remember, there's no malice or intent in these robots. All they know is that this action in this state provides this reward. The third concept is what I'll call scope bleed, is when a machine learned system learns to affect the world beyond its scope as a second order effect. Imagine a Roomba that does machine learning for planning its route. It assigns itself a high score if it covers a large percentage of the home area and a low score if it runs out of battery and dies before making it back to its charging dock. Suppose the Roomba decides to drive all the way down a super long hallway and just before running out of battery, just due to random experimentation, it decides to start beeping over and over, saving its battery by not moving. Eventually, you'll get annoyed and go pick it up and either turn it off or put it back into its charging dock. Either way, it avoided the low score associated with running out of battery and in fact learned, just a little bit, that beeping incessantly at low battery results in being placed in the charging dock. It doesn't know why, it has no concept of you or what happened, all it knows is that it gets a good score for beeping like that. The Roomba is supposed to be learning a restricted task, driving itself around your apartment. Somehow, it has learned a way to influence you, an element supposedly not involved in the task it's learning. Its scope has bled from just itself in the apartment to you. We don't really care about Roombas, so let's talk about Cobra Dane. It's one of a series of enormous radars managed by the Air Force. The gigantic radar sits on an island in the Aleutian Island chain and points at Russia, watching for ICBMs. Imagine an AI controlling it with a reward signal that provides high scores for successfully tracking targets. Due to random exploration of actions, it emits a rapid series of pulses that Russia detects and interprets as some kind of fire control radar. Russia prudently scrambles a squadron of Marine patrol aircraft and fighter escorts, and suddenly, there are dozens of targets to track, and Cobra Dane tracks them all, getting a very high reward. The radar has learned, just a little bit, that emitting that series of pulses tend to result in good scores. It doesn't know it's provoking a nuclear peer, it's not trying to trigger Judgment Day, all it knows is that this action in this state results in this reward. So how do we stop this sort of thing? Well, there are lots of options that won't work. What about the fire inhibitor switch? Commissar Caiaphas Kane, hero of the Imperium, makes a reasonable suggestion. The fire inhibitor switch, or the fizz, is common on US Navy warships. This is a physical lock that must be turned with a physical key and represents a physical break in the firing chain. Well, first, I think I've shown that an AI could non-maliciously learn to induce a human to turn the key if it was in its mathematical incentives to do so, but beyond that, it doesn't fit the game theory. Keeping a human in the loop defeats much of the point. AI is supposed to react faster and better than a human in response to a much larger amount of information. If the AI says fire, fire, fire in full panic mode, and the human doesn't want to turn the key, wargame style, you'll be outmatched by a competitor who gives the AI free rein and has a much tighter OODA loop. We've managed to control another superweapon from destroying the world through diplomacy, and internationally constituted regulatory bodies, why not use those solutions? Well, that won't work either. Not only is AI not limited by a rare element that can be monitored and tracked, it has an extremely low barrier to entry and is super easy to hide. What would UN AI inspectors even look for? There are no spinning centrifuges to spot on satellite imagery, and even if you had the cyber chops to spy on someone's data center to see what kind of model they're training, this training can be switched from learn to cool this data center to learn to win a dogfight in seconds. On top of that, transfer learning has become such a common technique where an AI trained on one task is repurposed for another task at a fraction of the computational cost that even apparently peaceful models can be weaponized. And anyway, the potential capabilities are simply too good. We'd like to believe that the world powers might recognize the risk and agree to limit use, but in game theory terms, this is not an evolutionarily stable strategy. Breaking the rules is too profitable, and once one person has broken the rules, continuing to follow the rules is too costly. Imagine everyone agreeing to a knife fight and someone shows up with a gun. You can either keep bringing a knife like an idiot, you can discard the rules and start bringing a gun, or you can foresee this possible event and be the guy who brings the first gun. So how is the US Navy involved? Well, once the increased capability is demonstrated in one area, it can only spread. A reasonable chain of events might be someone at Naval Reactors saying, well, if Google can cool their data centers with AI, we can cool a reactor with AI. And then some Air Force general at Stratcom overhears the sub guys talking about it and says, well, if the Navy can use the AI to run subs, we can use it to run planes. And of course, that's literally Skynet. The Terminator even runs on a neural network, and the special chip that Cyberdyne uses to power it kind of looks like a TPU pod, I'm just saying. So how do we stop it? There are some things we can do to mitigate the coming AI disjunction event. It has to start with politics um, because of the game theory. Even during the most disastrous stages of the Vietnam and Korean Wars, nuclear weapons were not used. The reason was that a politically viable option was because of the international and domestic taboos around nuclear force. Accused of deliberately allowing our boys to get killed by not using nukes, the president could reasonably choose not to and maintain electability. When the time comes to choose between ongoing US losses against an AI reckless competitor, the political landscape must be such that elected officials can say, no, US losses are an acceptable cost. In order to avoid losing control of our military to AI, I will not increase military AI autonomy at this time and remain electable. Remember that the only reward system for politicians is electability. Second, AI use must remain tactical in scope. I just said that AI can bleed its scope, but we have to make that a requirement. The Alpha Dog tournament was a StarCraft style AI tournament for fighter jets, and the winner consistently demolished the best human fighter pilots. That's a reasonable mission to turn over to AI. Strategic bombing? Collection platform by location? No way. We can use AI to make recommendations, but AI shouldn't control these systems. More scope bleed is required to turn a tactical AI into a strategic threat than to turn a strategic AI into a strategic threat. Third, instead of thinking about AI as a military tool, it should be thought of the way we think of espionage. It is quiet, unregulated, and unacknowledged, even though everyone knows everyone else is doing it. Just as a world leader might confront another world leader about some problematic intelligence operation that the leader would, in the interest of their country, deny, so might one leader confront another about problematic AI applications. Even when the other leader denies it, the message is sent. Neither side can stop the other from conducting espionage, but unspoken norms might develop. So are we screwed? This all sounds pretty bleak, but maybe not. While I imagine an AI disaster is coming, an AI disjunction may not follow. Perhaps because, like mass shootings in the US, AI disasters become normal enough that it's not enough to generate political or cultural inertia. By the same token, perhaps we simply won't be willing to give up the smartphone or whatever quality of life gadget in order to guarantee AI stability. Perhaps a disjunction occurs, but it is a temporary or gray event. Regulative legislation could exist anywhere on a spectrum from the Keene Act and Watchmen, simply outlawing AI, to the Mutant Registration Act and X-Men, where you just have to register your tech. Both have precedent. We've outlawed chemical weapons, but we allow encryption in wireless tech, you just have to apply for a license. So the conclusion, there's nothing that can stop AI from disrupting the world in ways we don't want. The trick is finding a balance between rejecting AI, as in Dune, and fighting AI, as in 40K. As researchers, practitioners, and policymakers, our responsibility is to develop a national culture that strikes that balance. How to do this, and the degree to which it must be done, I leave as an exercise for the reader.